So Gokhale was actually the third generation of what can broadly be called the Pune liberals. So Pune was actually what was called then a small city in terms of population, must be 100,000 people at that point of time, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. But it had a galaxy of great men and of few great women as well, you shouldn't forget. Now, Pune actually, with Calcutta and Mumbai, were perhaps the crucibles of the new nationalism which emerged after the 1857 loss. The old system collapsed and it came. Now, what makes these Pune liberals so special? Now, I'm giving a very personal view. But remember one thing, that our normal understanding of Indian history is that the British captured India in 1757. But actually, Pune, the Peshwa was ruling till 1818. That was the last indigenous political force to be, defeated by the British. So by the time people like Ranade and Gokhale came into their active years, there were still very firm memories of Peshwa rule. So the easiest thing for these people would have been to look back, and hark back on some old glorious age. And such revivalism is a very common tendency in India, right? You say that, we lost power and some evil force has come and we should try to go back to what we lost. I think what the Pune liberals, their finest contribution to intellectual discourse in Western India and across the country was that they looked forward. Peshwa rule was gone, 1857 was gone. They had a completely modern sensibility, and I'll try to explain what that meant. But I think that is the first thing you have to, grant them, that extreme intellectual clarity, that if India has to emerge as a powerful nation, it has to look ahead, it cannot look back. It does not mean that they turned their back on Indian tradition. They were scholars of religion, they were scholars of the Dharma Shastras, but the main thrust of their thinking was of how to take India forward as a modern nation. Now, I said that there was intellectual clarity in this. There was also great moral courage. Gokhale and the liberals, they faced pressure from three sides. One is because they firmly stood on the side of social reform. Social reform included, at that point of time, the rights of the so-called lower castes, as well as women and education for women. So they had to face popular pressure. It was not a very popular position to have at that point of time, to argue against traditional social arrangements and argue very strongly for social reform. So that's one set of pressure they faced. The second set of pressures was that it came from the radical political elements who thought they were too moderate, and in effect they were compromising with the British Raj. So that's a second source of immense pressure and criticism. And the third was from the government. You see, they were always, their enemies thought them moderates, but the government of the day always thought them to be sort of, radical elements. So this moral courage, this commitment to take a path which was not easy and face all these pressures was an outstanding achievement. And I think we are reaping all the benefits of it today. And of course, it's been a long history and the Constitution is an important part of that. But I think they set the base for the creation of modern India. And I think if you look at Ram Guha's book, Makers of Modern India, you'll see that these people, all of them are there, as people who made modern India. Now, what were these elements of modernity which the Pune liberals talked about? What makes a modern nation? So there, obviously, they were nationalists, right? So their concern was that why did India arrive at this situation where, it's down on its knees and it's ruled by a foreign power, and how do we build a new nation? So there were about 4 or 5 important elements of their thought, and I'm really simplifying this, but perhaps later in the discussion we could take this forward. One was economic modernization. Gokhale, Ranade, Dadabhai Naoroji, all of them believed that India needed to modernize. It had to build a new industrial structure. needed to build a new economy. So that was one part of it, to break away from the old feudal system and build a new, if you like it, a capitalist economy. The second was social reforms. They were liberals. And you could say that part of the social reform urge obviously came from the concept of rights of man, that every individual should have equal rights. And also partly because all of them were keen students of economics, and Gokhale's budget speeches are outstanding works. And no less a person than Keynes, in one of his letters, says that, I'm amazed at the mastery of economic logic of this man. So, while social reforms could be seen as one element being the rights of men, of all human beings, the other was that, you create mobility, you sort of widen the pool of skills and education which is needed for a modern economy. The third, obviously, is individual liberties. They were liberals in the classic sense of, John Stuart Mill was a liberal. The fourth was the role of education. Gokhale, in 2010 we got this Right to Education Act, which has flaws, but anyway, it's an act. Gokhale in 1910, Sunil, right? He shepherded a similar, that all Indians should have the right to free and compulsory education. It was a very, very critical part of their agenda. And today, when you see, when you say that the Indian education or the lack of skills is one of the, not just for as an economy, but as a political democracy, that one of our constraints. You see the importance of that. And the third and the fifth was moderate politics. You can call it moderate politics, reasoned politics, constitutional politics. But they were as committed to means, political means, as they were to political ends. And, Ambedkar, of course, later in the Constituent Assembly made this famous speech where he said that, now that we are a free country, we have to give up the mode of satyagraha. Gokhale in 1907 did vaguely support satyagraha. He didn't actually dismiss it. But I think the thrust of his politics was moderate, constitutional, reasoned. In fact, if you read all of them, you will always find that it's every speech is based on logic, on data. There used to be something called the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, which was the sort of group of the liberals brought it together, and they had a journal, a quarterly journal. And believe me, when you read the journal, today we talk about evidence-based policy, but some of the work they did on famine, on farmer distress, it stands test of today. There's actual sample surveys. So everything was based on deep intellectual study, reason. The use of reason. So that's what I think were the main broad brush framework of Gokhale's work and the work of the Pune liberals. Now, what binds us all together? And again, I'll just mention two things and then I'll stop and perhaps I can hand it over to Sunil. The first was that whatever they talked about, whether it was economic modernization, social reform, education, it was always under the backdrop of nationalism. So I think Nitin has used the word liberal nationalism, and they were liberal nationalists. It was not some ideological flight of fancy, that we need this or we need that. The core question again was, how do you build a modern progressive Indian nation? Sorry. So almost everything they did in their writings, in their practical work, was against the backdrop of nationalism. And I think this is true. Very often today when we look back, we try to dismiss people, right? Nehru was a socialist, so and so was this. I think everybody was struggling with the same question. Right? Whether it's Nehru, whether it's Gandhi, whether Rajaji, whether Savarkar. The question before them was, how do we build a united, powerful, or strong, progressive Indian nation? They had different answers. So I completely agree with Nitin, they were not just liberals, but they were liberal nationalists. And the second was, they were pragmatists. So they engaged with the British Raj, which is why they got a lot of flack. But Gokhale actually once said that I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step is enough for me. So I think, they were not utopians in the sense that they wanted to go step by step. So their politics was not based on some abstract principles or ideological assumptions, but it was built painfully in the light of knowledge and experience. So I think that if you look back, I'm always amazed that here is this small group from a small city which completely, they created what is at least in Western India called the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, obviously, the Indian Renaissance didn't go to its logical end. And there is a famous Marathi scholar, he's dead unfortunately now, called R.B. Patankar. And he wrote a book called Apurna Kranti, which means the same in Hindi as well. It is the revolution that didn't sort of go to its logical end. And he asked this question, which is partly again, I suppose, what we will discuss, that for all the promise, why didn't Indian liberalism deliver? And whether today, the new India, what they said, has any role.
On the social reform and the social justice angle, you have the whole basis for everything is education. And I think Gokhale has achieved in education and sensitized people in the area of education through not only his right to education bill, which he did in 1910, but Gokhale looked at education as a value. Today, the whole problem of education is that we send our students from first standard, move into 10th standard, then 12th standard, then somehow they become graduates, etc., etc. They have no purpose of being educated. And Gokhale gave this purpose that if this has to look as a value system and look as education that would create a power center in you, then this would create a different kind of atmosphere everywhere. And that's why his whole impetus through the Right to Education Bill was to educate, to have free and compulsory education, that is primary education. So that was the basic thing. Free and compulsory. And in fact, if you look at that bill and contrast it with the bill which is currently, or any other bills which are passed currently, something that we can learn and something that needs to be done as part of, as a progress towards achieving implementation of law is Gokhale had all these bills in 3 phases. The first phase would be to write about what the current situation is. The second phase would be what is the solution or what is the law, actually what does he propose as part of the law. The third part is interesting and in fact that needs to be done is, which Gokhale used to propose in his law, is how to implement this law. And implement it from these 3 angles. The perspective would be, one is economic angle. See, if you say that education has to be made free, then we have to look at from where is the money going to come for this free education. So Gokhale proposed in his bill that how this money would come from the center, from the states, or who would pay for that. The second aspect is the social aspect, is that if this free education has to be made, then people have to be sensitized that they need education. And if that has to be done, in fact in 1910, Gokhale travelled across the country to let people know what is the importance of this free and compulsory education. Of course, at that moment of time, the people who opposed him were Indians themselves. So the Britishers had wanted this bill to be passed, but it were the Indians who opposed this. But that apart, he had this whole idea that this needs to be passed on to the people so that they become what we could say ambassadors of this education system itself. From the economic angle, I think the budget speeches are Gokhale's landmark speeches. In fact, during the centenary year, Gokhale Institute has brought up a separate volume on and an analysis on what can be learned from these budget speeches itself. So you can, I think, ask Gokhale Institute or download from their site. This is one aspect. And you will see that this is the budget aspect, but the other aspect of economy is that to every problem, there is an economic ideation which we have to look at. So even if you say that some social change has to happen, you'll have to look at what is the economics of that social change. So everything relates to, and as we say these 4 corners, as Gokhale would say, that they have interdependence. Okay, this dependence is natural. And so when you make some social adjustments, economic, For example, in Maharashtra, when you have this drought, there is a package which is announced for these drought-stricken farmers of 1,000 crores, I think, by the Chief Minister. Then we have to understand that if to solve a social problem, if you have some payment made, then there is an economic issue. If you have economics, then there is a social issue. If there is a social issue, then there has to be a political will for that. And so these interdependencies have to be worked. And so all his bills or all his solutions would have these interdependencies together. The one bill which is the basis for this Gokhale and Gandhi struggle is the Indentured Labour Bill, which was proposed in 1910 by Gokhale. And what is this indenture? Or it's called the Girmityar, the question of Girmityar. That is, if there is an employee, and today we face this problem, is that if the employee is a non-Indian, if an employee is a non-Indian or a foreigner, and the employer is a non-Indian, and the employee are the Indians, then the kind of exploitation that happens. So today when IT folks travel to US or other countries, then the kind of exploitation and the kind of racism that they have to face is exactly what indenture means. In fact, about 1.5 months back, in Times of India, they wrote about American indenture. This is about a month back. They talked about American indenture system. Written about how Indians are facing problems in US. And what Gokhale did then in 1910 is raise this question of indentured labor very vehemently against the exploitation of the so-called coolies, which today come as IT coolies. Then it was the same coolies. And this indenture made Gokhale an international leader. There is a Gokhale Hall in Mauritius. There is a school in the name of Gokhale in Fiji. In fact, when I started all this, I got letters and emails from Nepal, Bhutan, Kuala Lumpur, Sri Lanka, and a lot of these places that we must do something for Gokhale. This is because of this whole voice that he raised against this indentured labor. In fact, the interesting thing about Gokhale and Gandhi is Gokhale's visit to South Africa in 1912. And Gandhi himself has written that if Gokhale hadn't come to South Africa, this problem would not have been solved. This indentured labor bill gave a legal framework to what Gokhale or what Gandhi had to do. Today, when we see a lot of these things as non-cooperation and instruments like FAST and these kind of instruments that are used, this is used without any legal framework. But if there was no legal framework which Gokhale proposed then the whole Smuts and Gandhi treaty would never have happened. Gandhi in his book on struggle of South Africa writes that the meeting between Smuts and Gokhale made the foundation or laid the foundation for the Smuts and Gandhi, because in any case Gokhale died in 1915 and the treaty is in 1916. I mean, I'm just scraping some surface of Gokhale's life because he was, in 1899, he was a member of the Bombay Legislative Council, where he first time proposed, the first question that he raised at the Bombay Legislative Council was about drought-stricken farmers. And today too, in 2014, we are still fighting that how to get about it. From 1902 to 1905, Gokhale was the president of the Pune municipality, where Gokhale proposed the 3-tier system from the Panchayati Raj, that is the village panchayat, to the central government. In fact, in 1909, when the decentralization committee was formed by the British person, Gokhale was part of the member, and he was the first person to propose this decentralization. Even the Morelim reforms, that's where again it was not written, the writer of this reforms was Gokhale himself, because that's where we see the decentralization. And Gokhale was also the elected member from 1901 to 1914 for the Imperial Legislative Council. So a huge work done in the area of partition of Bengal. In fact, in 1905, when Gokhale became the Banaras Congress president, he raised the voice against the partition of Bengal. In that year, Gokhale went to England. In 50 days, he gave 45 speeches. Understand, it's again difficult because there is no system like this. And there he spoke against Lord Curzon, who had brought this partition of Bengal. It's nice to raise voice here in this country on streets and raise slogans. But to go to a place, go to Britain and say something against the Britishers? Difficult. And that's where Gokhale stood out. In fact, the other 1905 Banaras Congress is important because of this partition of Bengal. A historian from Assam has written a book on the best, 10 best Assami people from Assam. Gokhale appears as one of the persons from Assam because of his work on partition of Bengal. It's a life full of so many events and so many things. I've just about, it's just a wash here and there. So I hope that more questions come up and Gokhale becomes a part of you, and you read more of Gokhale to know that the way you live, the way we live today is Gokhale living. Thanks.
We've not really paid attention to social science. History was a subject which we had to quickly mug up so that we could, go and study physics and maths and other things. So we have been poorly educated about our own intellectual history, and people like me sort of discover this later in life. But Indian history itself is often like a very exquisite ancient monument on which they put this plaster, this gory, dirty plaster, unthinkably posted on a very beautiful monument. And this plaster which we post on Indian history is that of this Indian nationalist, Indian freedom movement narrative. So our heroes are hoisted onto a pantheon, and then they are deified or vilified depending on what the politics is, but they are on a pantheon. And if you ask people who was Gokhale, he was a great freedom fighter. What did he stand for? India's freedom. Who was Nehru? A great freedom fighter. What did he stand for? India's freedom. Who was Nehru? Who was Gandhi? Same thing. Right? So all these great people we raise onto a pantheon, they stand for one thing, India's freedom. But they stood for a lot more than that. And the history of how, from the process of Ranade all the way down to Ambedkar and the intellectuals of modern India, there was an intellectual history. There was a chain of thought. There were arguments. There were nuanced positions that they took, none of which we are really familiar with. So trying to rediscover this itself is a problem. But we have a situation where we just put heroes onto a pantheon, we don't study them, we don't analyze them, we don't really care what they stood for. So this fate has not escaped Gokhale either. So it is in this kind of a milieu that we grew up, I grew up. It is in this kind of a milieu that our children are growing up, without knowing the nuances of the positions and the debates that took place, beyond the fact that there was a great independence movement. Many of the things which Gokhale and the others were worried about in 100 years ago are the kind of things which we are worried about today. I'll give you three sort of debates. The first is the debate, the contestation between reason and passion. Gokhale and his side of the fence would try to persuade people using reason, facts, analysis, and make them come towards a certain conclusion. On the other side were people who would be on the side of passion. So the method was not so much using persuasion, but to incite emotion. Right? So this process of politics and political argument continues to this day. You have a bunch of people trying to persuade people using reason. It's a very small number. Niranjan is one of them. If you read his editorials in Mint and some of the column writers in Mint who are also sitting here, and I think most of the people in the front row you can see are in that school of thought where we try to persuade people through reason. But there are a lot of others who try to persuade people through inciting emotion. This continues to this day. The second dichotomy or this dilemma which existed then and which exists now is this difference between patience and revolution. Gokhale was on the side of patience, as one step at a time, as you said. Constitutional methods. We will lobby the British. We will take the legal recourse available to us. We'll use the freedom that is available to us to push the envelope a little bit more, and over a period of time, we will achieve success. On the other side, you had people who wanted revolution. They wanted things to happen immediately, or next year, or next month. And this is something which we see today, not probably also because the demographics are such. Half the population of India is below the age of 27. So people in their teens and their 20s tend to be more hot-blooded, want to see results tomorrow morning. But yet we also know that the system we are in today, we are not in the British Raj, we are in the Republic of India. But a democratic republic has processes, and a democratic republic can't you can't ride roughshod over a democratic republic just in order to get results. So there is this contestation between patience and revolution, constitutionalism and mass movement today. And the third, and I think this is probably the most profound one, is that anybody who has studied public policy, has been in public life enough, or thought about this deeply enough, will come to this conclusion. There are problems you can solve with public policy, and there are problems which you can't solve with public policy. There are problems which the government can solve, and there are problems which the government cannot solve. What do I mean by this? Swachh Bharat, for example, which Prime Minister Modi spoke about. Cleanliness, hygiene. Now, there are issues here which the government can solve. There is so much that the government can do to impose rules or probably create incentives for greater hygiene, public hygiene, etc. But then, unless society and an individual realizes that it is necessary to keep your house clean and to have a toilet and keep the toilet clean and not sweep the dirt onto the public street, you will not achieve Swachh Bharat. So anybody who studied this, and I found this when I read Gokhale, when I read Tagore, when I read Gandhi, when I read Nehru even, all of them came to the conclusion that ultimately there is this problem of social revolution, individual reform. When you reflect on your own life and your behavior and change. Until that happens, you're not going to be able to solve this. At Takshashila, we call this the Mahatma grade problem. Right? These are the problems which public policy cannot solve. You need a Mahatma or someone to come in and wave a wand and say, oh, tomorrow we're going to solve. Tomorrow all of us are going to follow traffic rules. There are these collective action problems that until everybody solves this at the same time, it won't get solved. Right? So we need these things. And these continue to this day. They were there in Gokhale's time and they are there today. Before I conclude, I just want to make 2 points. One is this idea of liberal nationalism. Like why? No, many people say liberal nationalism doesn't make sense. It's an oxymoron. Because especially those people who have studied nationalism in the European context believe that nationalism is this very fascist, very negative kind of an emotion, which is usually directed at the superiority of one group of people, one nation, and therefore has to dominate other nations. But if you look at Indian nationalism, it was never directed against anybody else. Gandhiji, for example, probably the most famous exponent of Indian nationalism, fought against the British, but he did not have hatred for the British. That distinguishes Indian nationalism from, let's say, German nationalism or others were European styles of nationalism. So, Indian nationalism, I would argue, has always been liberal in its character, whether it is through Gokhale, whether it is through Gandhiji. And Indian nationalism and Indian liberalism have been conjoined since the Pune liberal days. There has not been, none of those Pune liberals would have, all those Pune liberals would have described themselves as nationalists. They were liberals and they were nationalists. And this is a tradition which we think has place and an importance in modern India. That we have to be liberal, we should be talking about individual liberty, we should be talking about pluralism, we should be talking about free markets, we should be talking about nationalism. These are not ideas which are contradicting each other if you look at it from an Indian context and tradition. And I just wanted to end with a few quotes from Gokhale, which I think I wanted to share with you, because they express the views of one who was trying to persuade people, trying to persuade the masses onto an enlightened view, enlightened way of ruling ourselves or conducting our own lives. First, he says, whether one works on a higher plane or a lower one is a matter of small importance. One is always glad of the appreciation by the public of what one has done. But it is not the highest purpose of existence, that is, appreciation by the public, is not the highest purpose of existence, nor really the highest. If it comes, good. If not, well also, though not so well. Right? So he says public appreciation is not really what we should be looking at. So he talks about how do you, in the milieu of the contestation with people, when he was accused of being he was accused of being a stooge of the British in the late 1890s. He was attacked viciously. He and his followers were attacked viciously. So he says it becomes the duty of all to consider what should be the attitude of the reformers towards those who are opposed to them. And he says, we have above all to learn what it is to bear and forbear, to bear ridicule, insults, even personal injuries at times, and forbear from returning abuse for abuse. So this is the idea of method of civilized discourse. You don't return abuse for abuse. Then he says, this is the last one, and one very good friend mentioned it to me. It's a slightly longer one, but please bear with me for a moment. This is the last one I'm going to say. Let us not forget that we are at a stage of the country's progress when our own achievements are bound to be small and our disappointments frequent and trying. This is the place which it has pleased Providence to assign to us in this struggle, and our responsibility is ended when we have done the work which belongs to that place. It will, no doubt, be given to our countrymen of future generations to serve India by their successes. We of the present generation must be content to serve her mainly by our failures. For hard though it be, out of those failures the strength will come, which in the end will accomplish great tasks. So it gives us this message of, don't worry if you fail, because if you fail, you are laying the foundations for future generations to succeed. The sad bit from here is that he said this 100 years ago, and I find ourselves saying this 100 years after he said that first. But I suppose there's always future. I mean, my son is here, he's 5 years old, and I suppose he's heard and made sense of some things which I've said. Thank you.